Welcome, everyone. My name is Mindy Shelby. I am a member of the clinical team at Aegis Sciences Corporation, and today I will be presenting an update on NPS trends in 2025. The following material is not authorized for reproduction without express written consent. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is a brief educational webinar examining detection of NPS at Aegis in Q3, Q4, and annually in 2025. Quarterly trends for the first half of 2025 are described in the 2025 mid-year update on NPS trends. Now, from this presentation, participants will be able to identify various classes of NPS and the most prevalent NPS identified for each class. Participants will also be able to identify trends in NPS detection. Those who missed the live presentation or would like to hear it again may find a recording of this presentation on the Aegis website. Please call 1-800-533-7052 if you need assistance accessing the recording. Okay, so new or novel psychoactive substances, also called NPS, are a diverse group of synthetic drugs designed to mimic the effects of illicit drugs or prescription drugs that are used non-medically, while circumventing existing drug control laws. NPS may be categorized into various classes, including designer opioids, designer benzodiazepines, synthetic cannabinoids, synthetic stimulants, hallucinogens and dissociatives, and others. NPS may change frequently as legislation to control specific chemical structures or classes of NPS is introduced. Now, once an NPS has been deemed a controlled substance, often new or modified non-regulated NPS appear. So this remains a challenge for regulatory and enforcement agencies, for monitoring institutions, clinical and toxicology laboratories, as well as healthcare providers. So Aegis offers NPS testing by class in both urine and oral fluid. Now shown here are 2025 NPS order rates by class. Now of the total number of samples with any NPS class ordered, designer opioids class was the most frequently ordered at approximately 95%, followed by designer benzodiazepines, and then the NPS other class. Order rates for synthetic cannabinoids and stimulants were similar at approximately 60%, and the hallucinogen dissociative class was the least frequently ordered class at approximately 36% of samples with any NPS ordered. Order rates remained relatively stable through 2025, and it is important to note that when evaluating the NPS data, order rates may impact NPS detection and observed prevalence between classes. Okay, so let's jump into the NPS other class. This figure here shows the proportion of compounds detected in Q3, Q4, and annually in 2025. Now, the NPS other category includes compounds that do not easily fit within other designated NPS classifications. And not all compounds in this class are illicitly manufactured. Some are veterinary medications or other substances that have been identified as adulterants in the illicit drug supply. For example, xylazine, which is shown in blue, is approved for veterinary use as a sedative analgesic drug, but it is not approved for use in humans, and it has been detected in the illicit drug supply. Xylazine has been the most prevalent NPS detected at Aegis, irrespective of NPS class, since 2023, and it remained so through 2025. But its proportion decreased throughout the year. It represented approximately 70% of detections in this class in Q1, and that dropped to approximately 54% in Q4. Now, annually, xylazine and its metabolite made up 63% of compounds detected in the NPS other class. Now, medetomidine and its metabolite, shown in lilac, were the next most prevalent compounds in the NPS other class. Now, like xylazine, medetomidine is an alpha-2 adrenergic receptor agonist and recently has been reported to be rapidly proliferating across the United States. Now, the proportion of medetomidine in its metabolites increased from Q1 to Q2, but it remained similar in Q3 and Q4 at about 26 to 27% of detections. Now, annually, medetomidine and its metabolite were approximately 22% of detections in the MPS other class. Now, phenibut, shown in green, was the next most prevalent compound in the MPS other class in 2025, increasing slightly from Q3 to Q4 and accounting for approximately 5% of annual detections. Now, phenibut is a synthetic gamma-aminobutyric acid analog with benzodiazepine-like effects. It is marketed in the US as anti-anxiety, nootropic, or sleep aid supplement. Now, use of phenibut has been associated with adverse effects and can lead to dependence and withdrawal upon cessation of use. Now, like phenibut, tianeptine and its metabolite, which are shown in purple, accounted for approximately 5% of detections in the MPS other class in 2025. Now, tianeptine is also called gas station heroin, and it is structurally classified as an atypical tricyclic antidepressant, but at high doses, it has mu opioid receptor activity. Thus, misuse can result in opioid-like highs, and users can develop tolerance and dependence. The FDA has reported that tianeptine products have been linked to serious adverse events, including overdose and death. Now, BTMPS, shown in hot pink, is an industrial chemical used in the manufacture of plastics and is a potent calcium channel blocker. It rapidly appeared in the illicit drug supply in summer of 2024 and was added to Aegis testing in December of 2024. It has since been identified as a public health concern. Now, BTMPS represented approximately 4% of detections in the MPS other class in 2025, with a notable increase from approximately 3% in Q3 to approximately 6% in Q4. Now, other compounds in the MPS other class together accounted for less than 1% of positives in 2025. Okay, so let's jump to designer opioids. This figure here shows proportion of designer opioids detected in Q3, Q4, and annually in 2025. Designer opioids with less than 50 detections in 2025 were included in an other category shown in pink here and here. Annually, they represented approximately 1.3% of positives, but in Q4 represented 2.6% of detections. Now, shown in blue is fluorofentanyl and its related compounds, despropionyl fluorofentanyl and fluoronorfentanyl. Now, together, they've been the most prevalent designer opioids detected at Aegis for several years. However, their proportion of detections decreased throughout 2025. In Q1, they represented approximately 59% of designer opioid detections, whereas in Q4, that percentage dropped to 48%. Annually, they represented 56% of designer opioid detections. Now, methylfentanyl-related compounds made up the second and third most prevalent designer opioids detected in 2025. Now, methylfentanyl has three positional isomers, ortho, meta, and para. In Aegis testing, the ortho isomer is distinguished from the meta and para isomers, which are not distinguished from one another. So orthomethylfentanyl and its metabolite despropionyl orthomethylfentanyl, shown in shades of lilac, together were the second most detected designer opioids in 2025. And despropionyl metaparamethylfentanyl, shown in green, was third most detected. Now, both orthomethylfentanyl and the metaparamethylfentanyl had a greater proportion of detections in Q4 than when considered annually, with orthomethylfentanyl representing 13% of annual detections and metaparamethylfentanyl just under 8%. Now, the next most prevalent designer opioid in 2025, shown in purple, was norcarfentanyl, which is a metabolite of carfentanyl, but also of remifentanil. Now, carfentanyl is a veterinary sedative for large animals and is not approved for use in humans. It is estimated to be 100 times more potent than fentanyl and has been found in counterfeit prescription pills. its proportions in Q3 and Q4 were similar at approximately 8 to 9%, and greater than its proportion when considered annually, which was roughly 6.5% of designer opioid positives. Now, nitazene analogs, shown in shades of orange, and improlidino nitazene analogs, shown in deep teal, were some of the designer opioids that saw significant decreases throughout 2025. And this is evident by comparison of annual proportions to the Q3 and Q4 proportions. Now, notable increases in designer opioids included tetramethyl 4AP, which is shown in peach. Now, tetramethyl 4AP is considered a tetramethylfentanyl-related substance, and it exceeded 50 annual detections and made up 5.7% of designer opioid detections in 2025, despite being added to Aegis testing in mid-December of 2025. Now, another notable increase in Q4 was for N-propionitrile chlorphene, also known as cyclorphene, which is shown in yellow. This designer opioid was added in June of 2025 and increased from less than 1% of detections in Q3 to 3.1% of detections in Q4. This designer opioid has already been associated with a number of overdose deaths, including at least 16 in Tennessee. And the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education reported its detection in 25 fatal overdose cases, 11 of which it was the sole opioid present. Okay, this figure here shows the proportion of designer benzodiazepines detected in Q3, Q4, and annually in 2025. So benzodiazepines with less than 50 detections in 2025 were combined and represented as other, shown in brown, collectively accounting for 3% of annual designer benzodiazepine detections. Now, in 2025, bromazolam and its metabolite, shown in blue, accounted for 68% of annual designer benzodiazepine detections. However, this proportion declined from 64% in Q3 to 55% in Q4. Now, similarly, the detection of 8-aminoclinazolam, shown in lilac, was the second most prevalent designer benzodiazepine annually, but was significantly less in Q3 and Q4 than in Q1, when it represented nearly 20% of designer benzodiazepine detections. Notably, phenazolam and its metabolite, alpha hydroxyphenazolam, shown in shades of green, showed a marked increase in the proportion of detections in the second half of the year, increasing from 22% of designer benzodiazepine detections in Q3 to 34% in Q4, while representing 13% annually. Now, the next most prevalent designer benzodiazepine was dialkylgidazepam, and its metabolite 3-hydroxy-dialkylgidazepam, shown in purple, was added to Aegis testing in June of 2025 and appeared to improve detection of dialkylgidazepam use. Now, in Q3, the metabolite accounted for approximately 7% of designer benzodiazepine detections, but decreased by more than half to 3% in Q4, remaining at 3% annually. Now, this figure shows the proportion of synthetic cannabinoids detected at Aegis in Q3, Q4, and annually in 2025. Synthetic cannabinoids with less than 50 detections in 2025 were combined and represented as other, shown in brown, and they represented approximately 3% of detections. So MDMB, Forian pinaca, shown in blue, has been the most prevalent synthetic cannabinoid detected at Aegis since 2022. Detection occurred predominantly via its butanoic acid metabolite and to a lesser extent its N-butanoic acid metabolite. Now, despite being included in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act in 2023, its proportion of synthetic cannabinoid positives remained stable in Q3 and Q4, accounting for 48% of synthetic cannabinoid detections in both quarters, and annually represented 43%. Now, MDMB inaka, shown in lilac, is a synthetic cannabinoid precursor that can be used to make several different synthetic cannabinoids, including MDMB 4-M pinaca. Now, MDMB inaka was often detected with MDMB 4-M pinaca and was the second most prevalent synthetic cannabinoid detected annually, representing 28% of synthetic cannabinoid detections. Now, 5-fluoro-MDMB pinaca, shown in green, represented approximately 20% of the positive synthetic cannabinoid results in Q1, but it declined to about 13% in Q3, but increased again in Q4 to 18%, resulting in an annual proportion of 17% and ranking as the third most prevalent synthetic cannabinoid detected in 2025. Now, detections of 4-fluoro-MDMB butanaca, ADB inaca, and MDMB butanaca in Q3 were similar to their annual proportions, and they declined only slightly in Q4. This figure shows the proportion of synthetic stimulants detected at Aegis in Q3, Q4, and annually. Interestingly, N,N-dimethylpentalone and its metabolite pentalone, which are shown in lilac, have been the most predominant synthetic stimulants detected at Aegis since 2022. However, following decreasing detection throughout 2024, they continued to decrease in 2025, declining from 50% of detections in Q1 to approximately 11% in Q4. Now, annually, N,N-dimethylpentalone and pentalone accounted for approximately 27% of detections and ranked second among synthetic stimulants detected in 2025. N-isopropyl butylone, shown in blue, is a novel substituted cathinone first identified by the Center for Forensic Science Research and Education in August of 2024, and it was added to Aegis testing in December of 2024. It emerged as the most prevalent synthetic stimulant detected at Aegis in 2025. In Q1, N-isopropyl butylone represented approximately 27% of synthetic stimulant detections, and it nearly doubled in proportion from Q1 to Q2. Its highest prevalence occurred in Q3 at approximately 61%, followed by a decrease to 47% in Q4. Annually, N-isopropyl butylone accounted for 45% of synthetic stimulant detections and was the most prevalent synthetic stimulant detected at Aegis. Now, the largest increase in synthetic stimulant detections during the first half of 2025 was observed for butylone, which is shown in green, and it rose from 2.6% in Q1 to nearly 11% in Q2. Its proportion was approximately 9% in Q3 and increased further to 17% in Q4, resulting in an annual proportion of 9% and ranking it as third most prevalent synthetic stimulant. And it was comparable to Utilone, which is shown in purple, which accounted for just under 9% of detections annually. Now, notably, all butylone positives in 2025 were also co-positive for N-isopropyl butylone. So synthetic stimulants with fewer than 10 detections annually were grouped into the other category, and this proportion of compounds increased from 7% in Q3 to nearly 11% in Q4 and represented approximately 6% of all synthetic stimulants detected annually. This figure shows the proportion of hallucinogens and dissociatives detected at Aegis in Q3, Q4, and annually. The ketamine analog 2-fluoro-deschloroketamine and its metabolite 2-fluoro-deschloronorketamine first appeared in April of 2022. Now, 2-fluoro-deschloronorketamine became the most prevalent hallucinogen dissociative detected in 2022, and it has remained so through 2025. Now, in Q1, it accounted for approximately 58% of detections and increased to 62% in Q3 and 72% in Q4. Annually, it represented approximately 63% of detections within this class. The next most prevalent compound was 2-fluoro-2-oxo PCE, which accounted for approximately 34% of detections annually. Now, hallucinogens and dissociatives with less than 5 detections in 2025 were combined and represented as other, and they are approximately 3% of annual detections. So now that we've gone through each class, let's take a look at the top MPS irrespective of class. So the top MPS detected at Aegis in the first half of 2025 are shown in the left column, and the top MPS detected annually are in the middle column. Now, the two most prevalent MPS in 2025 were xylazine and fluorofentanyl and its related compounds. And now these were also the top two in 2024. Now, overall, the relative ranking of top MPS remained consistent from the first half of the year through the end of the year, with 3 notable exceptions. So medetomidine increased from the 5th most prevalent to the 3rd most prevalent. Norcarfentanil rose 3 positions, and the designer benzodiazepine 8-aminoclonazepam declined by 5 positions. Now, several compounds introduced in December of 2024 appeared in the top MPS list even within the first half of 2025, and these include the designer opioids orthomethylfentanyl and meparamethylfentanyl, as well as the emerging adulterant BTMPS. Additionally, the inclusion of phenazylam metabolite in June of 2025 improved detection of phenazylam, contributing to its appearance among the top MPS detected in 2025. Now, the MPS other was the most represented MPS class in the top MPS detected, followed by designer opioids, and then designer benzodiazepines and synthetic cannabinoids were equally represented. Differences in MPS class order rates may influence these findings, as ranking is based on the total number of detections. Now, the illicit drug supply continues to evolve as novel psychoactive substances emerge in response to regulatory efforts. Now, due to constant change in drugs that are circulating, definitive testing methods are required to assist providers in identification of high-risk drug exposure. Findings from Aegis testing data in 2025 highlight ongoing shifts in substance use patterns and underscore the importance of comprehensive, up-to-date toxicology testing to support informed clinical decision-making, patient care, and public health response. So highlights from 2025 include designer opioids were the most frequently ordered class. Xylazine remained the most common NPS other compound despite decreasing throughout the year. Fluorofentanyl remained predominant in designer opioids, but N-propionitrile chlorphene is emerging. Bromazolam continued to dominate designer benzodiazepines, but we saw phenazylam is increasing. MDMB, 4E, and Panaca remain the most prevalent synthetic cannabinoid detected, and N-isopropyl butylone emerged as the most prevalent synthetic stimulant in 2025. Now, most hallucinogen and dissociative detections were attributed to ketamine analogs, particularly 2-fluoro-dischloronorketamine and 2-fluoro-2-oxo PCE. And that concludes our webinar. I would like to thank you for your attention, but before we wrap up, I want to tell you how to get in touch with us for additional clinical support. The individuals pictured on your screen are my colleagues, the clinical scientist team. You are welcome to direct questions to the phone number or email address on your screen. The information covered today will also be available in written form, accessible online on our website. Thank you for joining us today. I hope this has given you additional insight into MPS detection in 2025 at Aegis. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.